What a good day to be here. Good morning. I'm going to try to get centered here. Look at this. Oh, we good? We good? Still coming in from outside? Yeah. So, warning, word to the wise. Don't mention to Chris what you're willing to do or what you're thinking about unless you're ready to do it. Yeah. Just so you know. Just a few weeks ago, when I preached before, I was talking to Chris and said, what's our next sermon series? And he said, oh man, I've got this great thing planned on Daniel. Here's the mistake I made. Oh yeah, I've got this really good sermon from a little while ago that ends on Daniel 3. Yeah. And Chris goes, oh, so you'll be preaching on May 19th. Thank you very much. So don't mention it. I mean, Charity's even worse about this. You don't have to mention it to Charity. She's like, so you're going to be volunteering here, yes? You can't say no. That's how half of you got involved in the ways that you're involved. So careful in how you're mentioning that. And a public service announcement for the church, for the body here. My wife and I volunteer in kids church once a month. And 2 weeks ago, we did our day in the 3 to 5-year-old class. We had 28 kids in that class. No. Did you hear the words coming out of my mouth? 28 kids in one class. Why? Because we need more volunteers. So, if you have kids in kids' church, let me strongly, without shame, urge you to consider volunteering for kids' church. Where's my boy Brady? He wanted to give me the slow clap last time. Okay? We need volunteers because we had 28 kids in a class. I think the Bible prohibits that. So help us follow the Bible and volunteer in kids' church. So we want to say welcome to everybody here. Welcome to anybody in the annex watching. We got an overflow room because we need it. What a great thing to need. If you're watching on Facebook Live, welcome. We're glad you're watching. And if you're watching on Facebook recorded sometime later this week, welcome to you. If you're listening on the radio later this week when this service is played, welcome. We're glad you're here. And if you're listening to this sermon, I can tell you this with certainty. It's not an accident. It's not an accident. Let me tell you how I know that. It's not because I think God is some divine chess master moving us around the chessboard of life. No, it's much more simple than that. People don't listen to sermons on accident. Last night, it wasn't like, oh, Saturday night was popping. It was good. You know, I was just right. Things were just right. And then it got crazy, got out of hand. And I listened to a whole sermon before. I don't know what happened. That doesn't happen. You listen to sermons because you've chosen to work on yourself. You listen to sermons because you want to expand and practice your awareness of the presence of God. Okay? It's not like not an accident. It's not like losing weight. Like, oh, dang, March was busy. I didn't have time to pull my head up. April's even worse, and I accidentally lost 5 pounds. No, that doesn't happen. Like, you lose 5 pounds, and suddenly you can fit into your wife's pants, like Chris. That doesn't happen. Yeah. Life is full of screens and distractions and all kinds of other opportunities. So if you're here or listening to this, it's because you said no to all those things so that you could say yes to being here. It's not an accident. So we're glad you're here. We're doing a series on Daniel. We're in chapter 3 today, and a part of this series is simply to offer exposure to the text. So we're going to hear almost all of Daniel chapter 3, and I'm going to invite Deb up on stage to read it for us.
Good morning, everyone. Please stand for the reading of the word, and gentlemen, please remove your hats. I'm going to be reading out of the book of Daniel, chapter 3, verses 1 through 8. King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue, 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messengers to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the provisional officials to come, and the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald shouted out,
People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, pipes, and the other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar, gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into the blazing furnace. So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. But some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. This is verse 12. But there were some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. Then King Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, "O King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue that you have set up." Verse 19, Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So they tied them up, threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants and their turbans, robes, and garments. Verse 23, so Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. But suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, "Didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace?" "Yes, your majesty, we certainly did," they replied. "Look," Nebuchadnezzar shouted, "I see 4 men unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god." Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. This is the word of the Lord, and together we say, thanks be to God.
You can be seated. We say a prayer for us before we get started. Heavenly Father, thank you for today, this opportunity. Thank you for all the people, the souls, the ears here. Let my words be a blessing to all of us as we seek your face. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So if you are paying attention at all to the few times that I've gotten to preach here, you might be noticing something about my style, which is this. I can't stay in one place in the Bible. I've tried it. It doesn't work for me. Here's why. This book that we have is so interconnected. If you read a story in here and you're familiar with the other content that's in here, you'll start to notice that one story is in some way connected to another story, maybe a previous story. And then you read somewhere else about a theme or an idea, and you start to notice there's all of these ways that same theme or idea keep popping up all over different places in this Bible. So if I start with one story, it just goes places. That's the way this thing works. That's the way my head works when reading this thing. And some examples. If you read in the Old Testament, the construction of the temple, the Jewish temple, it was these concentric circles, which created all these different layers. And certain people, parts of society, were only allowed in certain layers. So everybody was allowed outside, and then Jews here, and then only men here. And in the very center, the Holy of Holies, Only the high priest was allowed. Well, that story is clearly hearkening back to the story in Exodus when the Israelites are at Mount Sinai, and the mountain is talked about in terms of different levels of elevation. Everybody was at the bottom, and then certain people were allowed here. Then the priestly class was allowed here, and up top you had Moses functioning as the high priest on the mountain. So you can't read either of those stories without noticing that they're in conversation with one another. If you look at the books of Kings and Chronicles, Kings is Israel's history over a certain period of time, and then Chronicles is next. And Chronicles doesn't continue the history here. It retells the same period of time, but with different details included, because the two books are in conversation. They're not in conflict. We've got a whole thing about contradictions. That's not quite the right word. What is the Bible doing? It's in conversation. So these books are sort of winking at each other and nodding at each other this way and that way. The book of Psalms, this collection of 150 psalms and songs and hymns and prayers, is broken up, if you don't know, into five sub-books. And those 5 sub-books are doing in poetic form what the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, are doing in narrative form. So the first book of the Psalms has all of this imagery that's sort of throwing itself back at Genesis and bringing up the similar themes, and then the same with Exodus and the other 5 books. It's fascinating. If you look at the book of Revelation, yeah, some of you know what I'm talking about. You can't read so many of the images without realizing that it's talking to later in Daniel, when there's more apocalyptic writing included. It's also talking to images from Ezekiel, where there's apocalyptic literature. Even Jesus did this. He's referencing the Old Testament as he's talking and preaching and bringing people around him. Probably the most well-known verse is John 3:16. Did anybody else have that drilled into your head? You memorized it as a kid, maybe as an adult. You saw that guy at football games holding the John 3:16 sign. Does anybody know what's happening right before that verse? Maybe John 3:14. Jesus is talking about Moses and some snakes in the desert, because he's referencing Numbers chapter 21. So all this book, just over and over again, there's these connections. This is a spider web of connectivity. Each story is somehow connected to other stories and connected to the whole. It's fascinating. So there's a principle I want to offer that the scholars will use when they're trying to interpret a story or a theme somewhere in the Bible. It's called the principle of first mention. This is the idea that if I read a story that has a certain sort of arc to it, or it has certain themes that it's brought up, or symbols, the principle of first mention says, I need to go to the first place in the Bible this was mentioned. And I need to understand this idea here, because everything later is taking from that idea. So if I understand the first place it was mentioned, I have a better idea of how it's being used wherever it is that I'm reading it. So here we are doing a series on the book of Daniel in chapter 3 about some faithful Jews who get thrown into a fire and they don't get burned up. Well, the principle of first mention says we need to look at the first time in the Bible that something is on fire and not getting burned up. Does anybody have an idea where this is going? Yeah. Anybody know? You hear? Yeah, Moses and the burning bush. So here's the problem. I've got to do a whole thing on Moses and the burning bush before we can even get to Daniel 3, because the two stories are talking to each other, I promise. Is that okay? Yeah. Can we do that? You guys ready? Yeah. 2 on 2. 1, 2. That is so weird and fun. If you get asked to do communion message or the drop or something, and you just have the stage, so you can really say whatever you want, just try that. It'll throw Chris off. It'll be great. It's fun. So here's the thing. We're trying to expose ourselves to stories during this series. So I've got to read a scene from Exodus chapter 3, Moses and the burning bush. I'm not going to make you stand because we had a long passage before, but you need to hear this story before we can even do Daniel 3. So this is Exodus 3, about the first 14 verses. One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he went deep into the wilderness near Sinai, the mountain of God. Suddenly, the angel of the Lord appeared to him as a blazing fire in a bush. Moses was amazed because the bush was engulfed in flames, but it didn't burn up. Amazing, he said to himself. Why is this bush burning up? I got to go see this. That was an inflection. God is not really in the Bible. When the Lord saw that he had caught Moses' attention, God called to him from the bush, saying, Moses, Moses. Here I am, Moses replied. Do not come any closer, God said to him. Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and Jacob. When Moses heard this, he hid his face in his hands because he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said to him, you can be sure that I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard their cries for deliverance from the harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I've come to rescue them from the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own good and spacious land. It is a land flowing with milk and honey. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You will lead my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Moses asked God. How can you expect me to lead the Israelites out of Egypt? Then God said, I will be with you. But Moses protested. If I go to the people of Israel and tell them the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, they won't believe me. They will ask, which God are you talking about? What's his name? Then what should I tell them? God replied, I am who I am. Just tell them, I am has sent me to you. This is the word of the Lord. And together we say, thanks be to God. So I want to use for a title for today's sermon a question. Why is the burning bush not consumed? Now, throughout history, the burning bush in this story has stood as a symbol for something which undergoes intense and ferocious persecution, yet it is not consumed. And the most common thing that this symbol has stood for in history is for the Jewish people. Throughout, even in their days in the Old Testament, the Jewish people have been persecuted. Even through modern history, no group of people has been more persecuted yet remains, even all the way up to the Jewish Holocaust. If the bush stands as a symbol for the Jewish people, it's like the bush is on fire, yet it's not burned up. Another popular thing the bush has stood for was the Christian church. All the way from its formation in Acts chapter 2, the church underwent pretty ferocious hardship and persecution, attempts to wipe it out for about the first 300 years of its existence. Even after it became the official religion of the state under Emperor Constantine, there are still places in the world today, and have been for its entire existence, where as a Christian you could be killed for your faith. If the bush is a symbol for the Christian church, it's like the bush is on fire, but not burned up. Another popular thing the bush has stood for is as a symbol for the Bible. No book has undergone such intense scrutiny or investigation as the Bible. Even with the dawning of what's known as historical criticism and textual criticism. Historical criticism is looking at the Bible next to how we do history for the rest of the world and what we know from archaeology and anthropology, and sort of comparing that to the Bible and seeing what's working and what is confirmed and what is maybe not confirmed or maybe disproven in the Bible. And textual criticism is the study of the ancient manuscripts of the pieces of the Bible that we do have, and looking at the differences and the changes and the problems that come up from the people who are studying this thing. These have been hard things for the Bible to endure. Many scholars have, after they've gotten into these fields, sort of given up their faith because of what they've learned, yet at the same time, other people from studying these things have sort of stepped into faith. Yet with all of this, the Bible is still the #1 bestseller in the world every year. It's taken off the New York Times bestseller list because it keeps getting #1, and they're like, yeah, we know that already. Interestingly enough, the people doing textual criticism on the ancient manuscripts now are finding the more they connect these pieces and look at all the ancient manuscripts written, actually the more reliable the New Testament is seeming to our ears. If the bush is a symbol for the Bible, it's like this thing is on fire, but it's not burned up. But today, I don't want to offer this bush to you as a symbol for the Jews or the church or the Bible. I want to offer this bush to you as a symbol for the individual believer. In 1 Peter 4, verse 12, it simply says this: Dear friends, don't be surprised at the painful trial you are suffering. like something strange was happening to you. Don't be surprised at the pain. Like this is strange. Don't be surprised thinking the pain is strange. No. So hold on to that. Here we are in the Moses story. Moses turns aside to see a strange sight, a bush that's on fire and not burned up. This was simply God's way of getting Moses' attention. And the story starts off by telling us that Moses is at work. He's shepherding the flock of his father-in-law Jethro. One of the interesting things about the Bible is there's so many scenes where God shows up to sort of tell somebody they're going to go do something for him, and they're almost always at work in all these scenes. So you have the story of Gideon in Judges chapter 6, where Gideon is on the threshing floor, he's threshing wheat. God shows up, and if that's a symbol for what he's going to be doing later, then Gideon's not going to be threshing wheat. The implication is that he's going to be threshing out the Midianites. You've got the story of David in the Samuel books. And when we meet David, he's a young man. He's a shepherd again, and he's killed some lions, and he's killed some birds. And if that's a foreshadowing for what he's going to be doing later, the implication is surely that he's not going to be killing lions and birds. He's going to be killing Goliath and the Philistines. You've got Jesus in the New Testament recruiting people. He's recruiting fishermen. And this is clearly a foreshadowing for what they were going to be doing, because he says, I'm going to make you fishers of men. Yeah. And there's a real clear takeaway. God can use you right where you are. Yeah. To follow Jesus, you don't have to become a minister or a super Christian. You don't have to be these people that think they have to speak Christianese. Can I say that? Does that make sense? You don't have to mimic the loud, obnoxious, Bible-thumping preachers. You don't have to use specific language. You just have to be you. Yeah. Jesus seemed really interested in this idea. And when he chose his 12 disciples out of the many people following him, he was actually doing something, pushing against the normal trend of his time. He wasn't the only traveling rabbi. He wasn't the only traveling healer in his time or at his time. Others were doing the same thing that he did. His job was somewhat known and common. The thing that he was pushing back against was other traveling rabbis and teachers tried to recruit the best and brightest around them, students from wealthy families or high social class, so that you had better people sort of following you around to make yourself look better. If you read the Gospel of Mark, have we ever done Mark here in this church? Especially in Mark, the disciples are dull. Jesus recruited normal people. Thank God for that. So here in Exodus, we've got God calling Moses, and Moses is working, tending the sheep of his father-in-law. And the implication is then, yes, he's not going to be shepherding those sheep. He's going to be the shepherd of Israel. So when God calls Moses, he tells him to go, and tells him to go confront Pharaoh. You're going to go back to Egypt, which you escaped from. And Moses protests 5 times throughout this story. He's like, whoa. You want me to go back to Egypt? Like, yeah. I just got out of there. Yeah. You don't send me back. I got out and now I'm good. Yeah. Right? People get famous from difficult parts in the world. It's like their friends are like, you get big. You don't want to go all Hollywood on us and leave us here in the hood. It's like, no, I'm not going to go all Compton on you. Yeah, I'm going to Hollywood. I'm getting out of here. And God is like, you're going back to the place you don't want to be. So 5 protests is kind of the minimum in that case. And God responds. Moses starts with saying, who am I? Like, who? I'm kind of a nobody. I got out of there. And another protest, he says, I'm just not a good speaker. I don't have eloquent words, and God listens to that. And then finally, Moses' 5th protest is, no thank you, send somebody else. Yeah. Which isn't really a protest, it's a no. And there's a real gentleness, a pastoral way in which the God character in this story is listening to Moses and hearing him out. Yes, this is where the first time in the Torah we hear that God becomes angry, but there's a gentleness. He's waiting for Moses' self-doubt to play out. The God character is taking into account all of Moses' shortcomings, his imperfections, his self-criticism. Does anybody here have an inner self-critic, or is it just me? His fears of the unknown, our lack of competency, character flaws, your arrogance, all of that is taken into account. How many people know we're not just talking about Moses anymore? Yeah, God gently says to Moses and to us, yeah, I know all that stuff. Now go. It's okay. I will be with you. So, well, I'm going to skip ahead in the Moses story to this moment, one of the biggest moments in the Jewish tradition, where Moses asks God a question. God's telling this big, scary thing to Moses, and Moses kind of stops the conversation, and he says, hold on a second. I got a question for you. If I go back to the Israelites, I got to know who's behind me. So Moses is like, hold on, who is this God telling me to go back to Pharaoh? So he asks God a very prudent question. He says, God, what is your name? And in ancient Egyptian culture, to know a God's name was to know that God's specialty. Because hidden within the name was a meaning that told you what that God's business was, their specialty. So, for example, the Egyptian god Horus is the god of the sun in their culture. And hidden within the name Horus is the meaning high above. And so the implication is that this god Horus, his business, his specialty, is to be high above with the sun. So when Moses asked God, what is your name? He's really saying, why don't you tell me what it is exactly that you do? Because I need to know. And if God had said something like, I am the God of the weather, that's how big I am, I can control the weather, he would be explaining part of his power, but also confining the rest of his power. By defining God with a name which tries to explain his specialty, we only end up confining God to only that specialty. I can imagine God saying to Moses, Moses, I cannot give you just one name. I can hear God chuckling, a divine chuckle. To tell you one name would only end up confining me and not defining me. Moses, I cannot give you one name. But he did answer God, and he said something to this effect. Echye asher echye. Now, modern scholars don't know exactly how ancient Hebrew sounded. We know modern Hebrew, but our best guess is somewhere along those lines. And that is a mystery. So there's a problem with those three words. Libraries worth of books have been written on these three words, first of all. So I'm going to scratch the surface for us, but not even start to make a dent. These words are commonly translated, I am who I am. The problem is the way the formation in the ancient Hebrew is, it could also be translated in the future tense, I will be who I will be. So some translators have tried to capture all of it, and they've said God's response was, I am who I am, and I will be who I will be. And they might put like an and, or either. It just gets really clunky. So there's all of these questions that come up in translating, and that's an example of some of the difficulty in rendering an ancient language into a modern language. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be, still doesn't say it. And the reason is, ancient Hebrew did not have a word for the verb to be. So when we use this word to be, like is, be, being, if you say something simple like he is tall, he is preaching too long, he is wearing girls' pants, whatever it happens to be, that is, in Hebrew, it would simply say he tall. The is, the verb to be, is simply implied. So the verb used here in Hebrew is hayah, that's the root form, and it's best rendered in English as to be, but to be for us just doesn't say it. Other places this verb is used in the Old Testament, it's used to convey a very large world view. So when you're trying to describe the state of the union, What's the world look like today? It is that Israel was split into two kingdoms, the north and the south. That global view is when Hayah would be used. If you're an old King James reader, it would be translated, it came to pass. Here was what the world looked like. And so to simply say in English, I am who I am, just doesn't do it. For our modern ears, we see I am kind of like this. But Hayah is a word like this. It's huge. So it's like God is saying so much more than I am. It's like he's saying, I am everything. I am how it is. I am how it works. For the King James lovers here, it's I am the one who comes to pass. When God said I am, he's using this big, powerful, large, all-encompassing word to describe himself and his specialty, which is something like everything. See, in the ancient world, if you had a specific need, you would go to the specific God that filled only that need. So here's a story about a people who have experienced a God that says, oh, all the needs, me, I am. I will serve all the needs. So if that's you, and you're feeling like my friends have abandoned me, like I'm alone, I got nobody around me, nobody in my corner, what I need is a friend. This God says to that, I am. And if you're sitting there thinking like my money is acting a little funny and my change, it's acting a little strange, what I need is a great provider. To that need, this God says, I am. And if you're saying my body is weak and worn and I'm beat down and I'm diagnosed or I'm run over and I don't know how long I can make it or if I'm going to survive, what I need is a healer. That God can say, I am. Whatever today demands, God says, I am. For some reason, this helps me see God as bigger, wider than I normally understand. Like, what's the state of the world? God. What's the being on which we rest all of our existence? God. Some other language has been found to describe this God, this being, like the ground of all being. Some people have simply named this being as source. Some people have named it as spirit. One of my favorites is the Christic energy that animates the universe. Okay? If you're too familiar with the word God when you talk or pray or do church, let me invite you to find different language that expands you and fills up your brain with something bigger, the Christic energy animating everything. So we started with a question, why is the burning bush not consumed? It's a strange sight. It would be very strange if you saw it. The answer, though, seems clear to me. The burning bush was not consumed because God was in the bush. Yeah. Some of you might see where I'm going with this, because I began by saying I don't want to use the bush today as a symbol for the Jews or the church or the Bible. I want to use the bush as a symbol for the individual believer. And if that's true, what a strange sight you become. Something on fire, yet not consumed. People can't figure you out. You don't make sense. Suddenly, you defy all logic. People see what you're going through and what you're dealing with and the struggles you've had, and you're still walking around in your life singing to God like that old spiritual, this joy that I have. The world didn't give it to me, and the world can't take it away from me. That wouldn't make sense. Life is a mess. Where I come from, they say life is a hot mess, right? People I meet in the hospital, I work at Providence, what they're going through and the diagnosis they have, terminal diagnosis, excruciating pain, and I see some of them still praising God, able to be thankful, walking around singing verse 2, this peace that I have. The world didn't give it to me, and the world can't take it away. There's people here, maybe you're one of them, going through perhaps like the toughest time in your life, and you're singing this peace that I have. The world didn't give it to me. You don't make sense. Why is the burning bush not consumed? Because God's in the bush. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 4, it says this, greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. And because God is in us, and part of who we are, if we're the bush, we might be on fire, but we're not consumed. Yeah? Yeah? Which brings us to a short story in the book of Daniel written several hundred years later after Exodus, which I want to quickly paraphrase again. You've got 3 Jewish boys who were from the land of Israel. They get conquered and taken away to Babylon, a foreign country where they don't know the language or the customs or anything. Try to get that in your head. And they're told to worship a golden image set up by the king, or you die in the furnace. And they say, no. And then they say to the king, "O king, this God that we serve can save us from your fire. But even if he doesn't, know that we're still not going to bow down." And they get thrown into the fire. And the king looks in somehow, and it's like he jumps. And he turns to his guard, and he's like, "How many people did you put in the fire?" And they're like, "Okay, we put 3 people in the fire very clearly." And his response is, "I see 4 people in the fire. There's another in the fire." Come on, worship band, thank you for that today. And the king says, "The 4th one looks like a god." The Hebrew is unclear here. It could be looks like a son of God, or it could be capital G. The 4th one looks like God. Whatever it is, there's divine presence in the fire. So I'm here to tell you that our God is still in the business of getting into the fire with his people. And that would be a great ending, except we're not done yet. Now we're finally to Daniel 3. Sermon 1, check. On to sermon 2. Is that okay? I said in the beginning, these 2 stories are in conversation. And I want to make that crystal clear. The notion of Jewish guys getting thrown in a fire and not burning up is very clearly a reference to Israel's most famous, most treasured story, a bush on fire that's not getting burned up. The Daniel 3 story is also kind of nodding. It's winking to what happened after Moses in the burning bush. You see, Moses comes down off the mountain, and the Israelites have set up a golden image which they are worshiping. And he's like, "Come on." He probably breaks something like a golf club when you're mad, and later he's like, "Oh, shoot," not. But these stories are in conversation. Moses comes off Sinai. They've got this golden image. They've made a poor choice. They made the wrong choice. And Daniel 3, this whole story with the fiery furnace, involves a man-made golden idol where Jews are being told to worship it. The connections could not be more clear. In Exodus, the golden calf story that Moses comes down off the mountain to see is a black mark on Israel's social memory. It's in our history, we really screwed up. We made the wrong choice. Hundreds of years later, a story is written down in a book called Daniel. It's saying something powerful to its hearers at the time. It's saying, look, here's another story with a golden image, and you don't have to bow down. Biblical narrative, the art of storytelling in the Bible, often doesn't tell you with words what you need to do or know or be. It shows you. Sometimes you don't have to necessarily look, sometimes you do look at what the story is saying, but then you look at what the story is doing. And to the readers of Daniel, this story is giving them a second chance from a bad decision and saying, this time we can make the right choice. Like, anybody know what I'm talking about? You have that thing in your past, like when you remember it, it just hurts. It's like, shame, I messed that up. And now I know. Now I know if that ever happens again, I'm going to do things differently. That's what this story is doing. That thing that eats at you, it kind of picks at you, that piece of regret. Next time, I'll know better to make the right choice. The Daniel story, as a story, is saying to its original readers, like, look, our ancestors made a terrible choice, the wrong choice, that it just hurts all of us to remember. And here's a story about some people, also after an exodus, after an exile, who have that same choice again, only this time they got it right. Ooh, does anybody else get goosebumps from that? It's too hot in here for goosebumps. How healing this must have been for the original readers. You want to know what this looks like in the modern day? It looks like Germany. If you've been to Germany, especially Berlin, there are Holocaust memorials all over the place. Yeah, there's big museums, there's statues, but they're smaller. There's plaques on corners of buildings, on posts on the sidewalk. There's little plaques or seals just baked into the concrete along the sidewalk as you go, just sprinkled throughout their society, remembering the awful choice made by their ancestors. And what this sprinkling has done for them is acknowledging our ancestors made the right choice, and we need to remember that, because now we're going to make the right choice. Never again are we going to make that kind of choice. We're going to heal ourselves by remembering this so that next time we can get it right. Interestingly, if you're keeping up with the refugee crisis right now in Europe, this is really a global crisis. It's centered in Europe. People are fleeing the Middle East and Syria especially. They're just flooding Europe because they're in danger of being killed or just being their homes blown up, all kinds of things. Just everything's changing. And if you look at Germany, Germany is now the single most welcoming country to refugees in Europe. It's amazing. They're saying, we were this country with this awful history of ethnic cleansing, and now we're the most welcoming country in all of Europe to the refugees. That is powerful stuff. Come on. I mean, like some of you are doing this today. You have junk in your history, maybe a whole season where you were junked out. You made the wrong choice and you know it, but now you're in a different place. You're in a different season, and every day you're making the right choice. Like, come on, recovery people. You know what I'm talking about. In the past, never again. Now I'm making the right choice. I said yes to all the wrong things before, and now I'm going to say no to them. Now I'm going to say yes to all the right things. The Daniel story is healing for Israel. So the Daniel 3 story also brings up some deeper questions, the kind of questions that get inside here. Those are dangerous ones. It's easy to talk about other people and healing ancient cultures, but it also comes after you on the inside. Some of you might be thinking, yeah, preacher, guy, whoever you are, that's a nice idea, but sometimes the fire burns you alive, and I've got the scars to prove it. Sometimes God doesn't save you. What do you have to say to that? Yeah. The Jewish and Christian faiths are built around stories where God shows up like a hero and saves the day, but our lives are built around the fact that that doesn't always happen for us, and we need to go there. The Daniel 3 story is aware of both of those possibilities, and it nods to both. And I'll show you. It's in verse 18. It starts with 5 simple words. But even if he doesn't. In the 3 guys' response to the king. If you take these 5 words out of the story, you can throw the rest of the story away. Because if you take them out and then you continue telling the story, one of 2 endings happens. You can take those words out, and the guys get thrown into the furnace, and they look like they're just being faithful, and God rescues them, and God is the hero of the story. And that's kind of boring. The Old Testament stories are far more nuanced than that. Or you take these 5 words out, and you throw the boys into the furnace, and God doesn't save them. They get to look like martyrs, but now God is suddenly the villain of the story because he didn't save them. These 5 words, but even if he doesn't, gives the 3 guys a choice. And now the choice becomes the hero of the story. Because of this line, their faith becomes the example that's put forward to follow. It's the heroic example. And we love hero stories. Don't tell me you don't love hero stories. Anybody been to a movie in the last 15 years? It was a superhero movie, okay? If you're trying to make a movie in Hollywood today that's not a superhero movie, like, get in line, okay? You're not Thanos, you're not getting into a movie. We'll explain that later, Charity. Like, Look, superhero movies, we need these stories. We don't all need these stories. Society seems to need these stories. Show me a superhero movie, and I'll show you that it's not about who can punch the hardest. It's about a choice that the hero is always faced with, making the higher choice, the harder choice, the moral choice, making the choice that the villain can't make. And that's what makes this story interesting. Find me a superhero movie where it's not about a choice, it really is just about who can punch the hardest. Like, that's a boring movie. Nobody wants to watch that movie because it's just not compelling. It's not grabbing at you. Good hero movies are never resolved by who can punch harder. They're resolved with the choices. We love these. We need heroic examples. One of the most well-known heroic examples of Christian faith in the modern day, this isn't cliche, Mother Teresa. Yes. Anybody know her story? This was a Catholic nun who went to Calcutta and started serving the people there who had nothing. They were dying, they were sick. And she spent her entire life caring for the last, the least, the little, the dying, and the dead. What an amazing example she is for us. She's a hero of the modern day faith. If only any of us could live up to that example. But that's not the point of hero stories. Be exactly like me, do exactly what I did. That's why all of our modern day superhero movies, they have special powers or technology that we don't have. The point is not to be that. The point is to look at the choice that they're given and try to emulate that. Look at the example of Mother Teresa and try to move your heart to open to people who are different from you in a more loving and healing way than you were previously. Another hero story from about 150 years ago. In 1865, in the island nation of Hawaii, they were under threat of a contagious disease that was brought by foreigners called Hansen's disease, which was eventually deadly if not treated. The king of Hawaii ordered a quarantine on the island of Molokai, on an isolated part of the island, and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who had this disease were sent there with almost nothing. They were sent there basically to die. In 1873, a Catholic priest named Father Damien volunteered to go serve the over 800 people that were in quarantine at that time. When he arrived, he reported that their living conditions were utterly inhumane. So during his time there, which was a leper colony, by the way, he was credited with helping to organize farms. He got money from governments and churches to build schools and roads and churches. He dug graves. He dressed their wounds. He built coffins. He shared meals with them. He shared pipes with them. He lived with them as equals. Under his leadership, basic laws were finally set up and enforced. Shacks were upgraded to houses. Infrastructure was established, and he helped them create a sustainable community. He helped give them their humanity. We may have this disease, but we're not trash. What an example. He wrote a letter to his brother, which we have today. This will sound familiar. He said to his brother, "To the lepers, I became a leper, to gain all to Christ." Because of Father Damien's examples, yeah, there's shrines, there's memorials. The Catholic Church made him a saint in 2009, sure. But his example, the story, pulls us, hopefully widening you, growing you, stretching you to become more caring and compassionate for the last, the least, the lost, the little, and the dead. Hero stories are powerful. Hopefully from them we're affected, changed, expanded, and grown. So looking at what a story is doing, hopefully this is all going to connect eventually. Looking at what a story is doing in its larger context is an important way to look at the Bible stories that we have. The most classic and common way to interpret a Bible story, especially the narrative stories, is by simply doing the thing where I place myself in that character's position. Chris did this for us beautifully in chapter 1 of Daniel, where he put us in Daniel's shoes, and he talked about the need for conviction in the face of affliction. I mean, that's the classic way to interpret Bible texts. And I want to place you, all of us, in a particular moment in this Daniel 3 story, back at verse 18. But even if he doesn't. The context of those words are, the king's going to kill us unless we do what he says. King, our God can save us, so we think that, we believe that. So we're not going to bow down because our God can save us. But even if he doesn't, know that we're not going to bow down. And one place we get tripped up, I mean, what an example of faith for us to emulate and move towards. But a place that we get tripped up is trading those 5 words for 4 different words. Only if he does. This is turning God into a divine vending machine. This is the notion that I will follow Jesus and follow this Christian way of life only if he does bless my life, give me stuff, keep suffering out of my life. You know, when things don't go my way, and I have, but only if he does, thinking, when suffering enters my life, I'm like, whoa, God, what happened? Wait a second. I've said the prayers. I've given the tithes. I've sung the songs and showed up and volunteered. How come this bad thing is happening to me? I thought we had an arrangement. I will praise God only if he does bless my life. That is very different from saying suffering is right at my door and I'm still going to worship God. I hope that God saves me, but even if he doesn't, I'm still going to worship God. Only if he does, faith. Only if he does give me good stuff and a good life. That kind of faith will implode the moment suffering enters your life. Yeah. So we're not Christian yet. It's not Christian yet. This sermon, it's Exodus, it's Daniel, and we got to make it Christian because this could be preached in a Jewish synagogue, so to speak, except for the couple of New Testament verses I quoted. The Exodus story is about a bush that's on fire and it's not burned up. Why? Because God was in the bush. Man, that's just a good takeaway. The Daniel 3 story is about a heroic kind of choice based on a faith that remains in good times and in bad. Then it tells about people who get thrown into the fire and they survived because there was another in the fire. That leads us to the Christian story. A group of people who believe somehow that God took on flesh and joined our world today. Yeah. Even when Jesus was gone, Christians somehow still believe that the Spirit of God is still present in and through, with us, moving and urging inside of us and all around us. In some mysterious way, we believe God is in me, God is in you, God is in all of us. God is in those people we see everywhere in life. God is in the person on the street just trying to find food and a place to sleep. God is within that person that you cannot stand. God is within that people group that you kind of naturally have a prejudice towards. Everywhere. Part of being Christian is seeing Christ in our world. And if life is the fire, Christians believe there's another in the fire. If the burning bush is a symbol for you and life is the fire, there's another in the fire. And that doesn't make everything all good. Believing that God is with you in the fire doesn't take you out of the fire. You're still in the furnace. God is with you whether you get burned up or not. But maybe if you have this, but even if he doesn't approach, it creates a profoundly different experience with your suffering. Instead of your suffering being punishment, what's happening? What did I do wrong? Maybe your suffering is an opportunity to connect with God. Sometimes you have to go into the fire before you get close to God because that's where God is at. There's another in the fire. I got to tell you how Father Damien's story finishes. He eventually contracted leprosy, and he was given the choice to leave the island and go get treated where things probably would have been very different for him. And he elected to stay with the people on the island and get some treatment there, but not enough, because he wanted to continue helping the people. And I wonder when I'm reading his story, did Father Damien have a, but even if he doesn't, moment? Did he wonder, am I going to be saved from this? Can I survive this? Can the treatment here help me? If not, what does that all mean? Where is God if I have a death sentence on me because of a diagnosis? He died in 1889, a heroic example. And so we have these stories about God rescuing people from the fire, but we live in this world where that doesn't always happen. And so we're Christians, and we believe and we pray to God for rescuing, and that's normal, that's fine. God, take this cup from me. But my hope for us is that within your prayer for rescuing and suffering, you can include in that prayer also 5 more words. Say them with me. But even if he doesn't. If you need to pray, there's going to be a team of people up here. Don't leave here without doing business with God today. If you need to talk about your fire and the God that is with you in the fire, please come forward today. This isn't a sermon or a prayer, it's simply a blessing. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face shine upon you and give you peace. Go in peace, serve the Lord with joy.